So my next question is, so my next question is, given all of that, what does principled solidarity look like? What does principled solidarity not look like? And and so can you speak about what you envision for us to be in solidarity with Muslims and Jews and poor people and people fighting against state violence and imperialism and capitalism and all these systems of domination that you've really listed out in your answers and presentations?
So I have a list of what it doesn't look like.
Okay. Yeah, that's
but
right.
yeah, so I feel like when we bring up the ADL and this statement that, oh, the ADL is doing all these horrible things, and it sounds like a lot of people are somewhat aware of that. And it's really interesting to me that a lot of us know that, yet the ADL is still at these vigils. They're still doing anti-racist trainings among our progressive organizations. Probably, yeah.
They do, yeah.
They're still in movement spaces. They were there on the streets during Ferguson, yet they praised the police and gave them an award for their service. So when we see this happening, we can't just be like, oh, that's so fucked up. Like, did you know that? We have to freaking get them out. So when your organization brings the ADL to do an anti-racist training or anti-bias training, don't let that happen. Sorry. I'm mad. Speak up when that happens. We need to get these civil rights institutions like the ADL are so entrenched into our communities. They'll try to stick wherever they can because it gives them legitimacy to float around in our spaces. But that's not okay. And when you see that happening, it's very important to call that out, to cut off those lines of communication, not communication, but those connections where they're doing everything possible to uphold themselves as something other than what they're really doing, which is funding terrorism. One thing, a really practical thing, when all these attacks happen, when all of these violent, horrible, tragic events happen, there's always that vigil. There's always this rally where people get a permit to be able to stand on the side of the road and not get in the grass. And people come out, maybe like 1,000 people come out. I saw that with the Muslim ban right after Trump took office. But then what? When they go home, it's over until we have another tragic event and so many people die. There's work that needs to be done. Show up to that event if you are able and it's accessible to you. But there's a ton of work that needs to happen in between those tragic events because they're gonna keep happening. And I guarantee you the work you do in between that will make change so that maybe one day we won't be seeing all these attacks and all of these state-sponsored terrorism instances. And then I'll do one more and then let y'all speak. So my friend Chris and I once had this idea, it's still ongoing, but we were like, let's walk around our neighborhoods and just knock on people's doors and see what they think about community safety and presence of police in their neighborhood. So we did this on a really hot day and we got discouraged and I got scared when I walked up to doors. But we talked to one person who was like, I've lived here for 10 years and I used to call the police all the time to take care of stuff, but now when I call, no one shows up. I'm gonna move out of the neighborhood. And I'm like, great, get out of the city into the county, bye. But then we were like, oh, there's someone with a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard. This is gonna be an easy one. Like, I'm glad to see that. So we walked up there. The guy answered and was like, I'm not very political. I've lived here for a few years. It's sad, but some people are being pushed out. Black people are being pushed out, but I really like that there's a new coffee shop down the street. I really like that there's a wine bar here. I feel safer. It's really shaping up to be a nice place. And we're like, there's a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard. What is happening? This is like complete dysphoria right here. So I've been walking around the city thinking like, oh, that person got me. Oh, I feel okay knowing that there's people that are outright in support of whatever. But that's a total fake ass like sign, symbol, hollow gesture of solidarity, and that's not okay.
Anchit is asking, did he put the sign there?
Oh yeah.
Oh, because there's some places where people rent and their landlord puts the sign there, but they did not put
I'm
the
pretty
sign.
sure he knows that, so he's like,
Okay.
I care about this, but I'm sorry, but I have to gentrify, you know? Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I think there's a lot, we talked a little bit about, if you're doing something around, Palestine, you're talking about, all of these, different kinds of oppression, Muslim, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish oppression, let's not fall into the traps of these interfaith, dialogues. A lot of people dismiss power analysis. I think that's one thing that we haven't really talked about a lot. Power analysis really helps us figure out who should be given more space and maybe lifted up in a conversation. So yeah, we should definitely be thinking about who has power in the society. So when you're having, a lot of people ask Palestinians to be part of dialogue groups. I don't know if you've all, heard this debate. Palestinians have rejected this idea that interpersonal relationships are the way to move things forward. They call it anti-normalization. Normalization was used actually by Trevor Noah to talk about, I think it was Trevor Noah, one of the analysts, comedic analysis, to talk about Trump. When we start to have Trump on all the time, and we broadcast every word he says, and we talk about every tweet, we begin to normalize, right, his reality. Well, Palestinians have said the same thing, we refuse to be part of dialogue groups that normalize the absurd reality that we live in. The absurd reality of military occupation for 50 plus years, for second-class citizenship, and for dispossession. We're not going to sit across the table from people that support those ideas. That's not, what we do. We will sit together with anyone, whether they're Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian, Sikh, whatever, right? If they are vested in our liberation, if they're there for co-resistance against our oppressors, then dialogue is open. That's not a problem. It's not anti-Semitic to say we won't sit across from a Jewish, person who doesn't reject our oppression. So I think just to think about principles in that regard, and also to think about why are Palestinians constantly called anti-Semitic for resisting their oppression? Because they would be resisting that oppression regardless of who their oppressor was. We're very unfortunate that we have Europe's victims as our oppressor. Our resistance would exist regardless of who was the state power.
Do you want
Yeah,
to-
just very quickly, and I'm coming at this. I'm pretty new to the St. Louis area, and I don't claim to know what solidarity is. I'm not a full-time organizer or anything, so I also defer to a lot of you who have much longer St. Louis experience than I do. But really just, to go back to this idea of thinking about the politics of precision. So for example, going back to the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism thing, Mina and I were talking about how in Germany there are some neo-Nazis that are claiming the title of anti-Zionism. And that doesn't mean we should have, so it is true, unfortunately, that there will be neo-Nazis, there will be anti-Semites that are occasionally going to claim anti-Zionism. But that doesn't mean abandoning those principles. It means being precise and getting those people out of our movement. And so I think that that's a really important move, rather than abandoning it or being scared of that. And to the same extent, right, as we talked about before, one very anti-Semitic trope that's centuries old is like the globalist Jew that's manipulating power. And so I think sometimes people who are not Jews are afraid to critique things like AIPAC, right, because of fear of that sort of echoing that narrative. But I don't think we should abandon the critique of AIPAC. We need to be precise, right, in that naming. So I think that precision is important rather than kind of abandoning those principles and values. And just to echo the kind of faith washing thing, right now there's a delegation to Palestine with a local clergy who's recently released a letter kind of talking about all we need is to talk and understand each other. And that's really irresponsible to me, because there's a power asymmetry framing this, and to not name that is really a disservice. And I think we need to hold those kinds of